Hi, this is James Beebe, your professor for epistemology. I wanted to record a lecture here, as I mentioned before, in order to review a number of facts about evidence to make up for the day that I missed on Monday related to my surgery. So I mostly in this video want to talk about some mistakes that people make in thinking that they've encountered some real, genuine evidence for some other claim. So this is more like the wrong way to think about evidence rather than the right way. We talked a little bit about the right way on Wednesday. We'll talk a little bit more about the right way when we get back next week. Um, so before getting into what I want to say about evidence and the wrong way of thinking about evidence, I just wanted to go over just a couple of questions very quickly from your exam before spring break. Um, so I have some screen grabs of 4 questions where there were students who had there's a higher percentage of students that missed the question, that got the question wrong. So here's one, question 7. According to the consensus view among philosophers, what it means for a statement to be true is for that statement to be backed up by evidence. So the entire point of talking about truth at the beginning of the semester was to distinguish truth from evidence. That's the number one. That was the number one goal. We also want to distinguish truth from belief. Just because you believe something doesn't mean it's true. But the reading assignment, all the discussion was focused on that. So I was a little surprised about that. I don't have a whole lot of deep things to say about these few questions that were missed by a lot of people. Like you can see that the correct answer is false, and half the people in the class got it wrong. I don't have a whole lot to say except for do pay attention to these major things. I mean, this one should have been clear. And so relatedly, question 10, according to the correspondence theory of truth, Joe's belief that the window is broken can't be true if Joe doesn't have evidence that it's broken. So again, the entire point of talking about the correspondence theory of truth is to make clear that this statement is false. So Joe can believe that the window is broken for no reason at all, or for a stupid reason. He's just irrational, idiot, something. He just likes to believe things on hunches. He believes entirely too strongly on hunches. There's a whole lot of things that could be true of Joe, such that he has no evidence. Um, Evidence is not what truth is about. Truth is about this thing in Joe's head, his belief. Inside his head is this idea: window is broken. Outside of his head, in reality, is a window, and it's either broken or it's not. And so, if what's inside his head corresponds to what's outside his head, or matches, that's truth, regardless of whether there's any evidence on the table or not. Um, so anyway, truth is matching, correspondence. There was another word that began with a C that one of y'all used that we kept using over and over at the beginning of the semester. It wasn't correlation or correspondence, but it was a good word, whatever it was that one of y'all used that I kept using in class. So in any case, every other writing assignment, second half of the semester, every single author is going to use truth to mean correspondence. You might have evidence for what you believe, might have no evidence. But whether you have evidence or not concerns whether your belief is rational or not. But whether your belief is true or not, well, that's separate. Uh, you can have a rational, true belief, so that your belief matches reality and it's backed up by something pretty good. Or you can have a rational, false belief. It's backed up by some pretty good evidence or reasons, but turns out you just happen to be wrong. Or you can have irrational true belief. You can believe that Trump was indicted this week, not because you read the newspapers or saw it on social media, but just because you looked in the bottom of your, I don't know, first of all, this intuition could just overcome you. I think Trump has just been indicted. Um, or you could read some tea leaves or something, or you could just guess, wishful thinking. So you might have an irrational or unjustified, unwarranted, but true belief. Your belief happens to match, but you don't deserve any credit for it because you formed the belief in this sort of dopey way. In any case, one other or two other questions very quickly are these. This one I was a little surprised about too. So we kind of did go on and on. I did kind of go on and on about how you can either believe that a proposition is true, believe that a proposition is false, or be agnostic. So it's a little odd that half the class would think there's no other option between believing it's true or false. And also, like with a question we didn't talk about an enormous amount in class, we did talk a little bit about the many gods objection, but just in the reading from Michael Roto, he just organizes his discussion. Here's one objection, the many gods objection. Here's infinite value objection, infinite utility objection, and well, they're just different. So the statement is false because I say according to the one objection, this other thing. In any case, just be sure to pay attention to those things. Okay, so let's, like I said in class, the next exam is going to be just like this one. So let's talk about evidence. Okay, so in class on Wednesday, we talked about evidence is just using appearances as a guide to reality. We haven't yet, well, in class on Wednesday, we didn't talk about how some appearances aren't really good guides to reality. I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, and it'll come up more in the week's classes that follow. And we also talked about how we need evidence. Generally, we ask for evidence, we demand evidence, we expect evidence. When someone's got a belief or a theory, a hypothesis, someone's making a claim, a statement about something that's not evident right in front of our faces. So here, as we said on Wednesday, here's one kind of statement of that form. There's a bear on the trail, but this is made in the circumstance where there's no bear standing right in front of you. And so it's appropriate, it seems, to ask for evidence, and someone can talk about the size of the paw prints. There's no mountain lion or any sort of other creature that would have make a paw that big. It can't be human for various reasons. And so we ask for evidence when things aren't right there in front of our faces. But of course, when the bear's right in front of our face, you could be a philosophy major and ask for evidence, but it can be annoying. So the basis of evidence is observed regularities. And what I want to talk about today are just how some mistakes people make in thinking that they have encountered a regularity, like, ooh, there's a pattern, a real pattern, and it's a suggestive pattern. Because I see this one part of the pattern, and there's a real pattern, I can infer the other part. And very often you can. But it's just useful to think about cases where people make some inadequate claims about evidence on the basis of what they think are real regularities. So on Wednesday, we talked about two kinds of regularities that serve as the basis for good evidential claims. We can know that we have got evidence for something if there's a cause and effect relation and we observe the cause. We have evidence that the effect is going to soon follow or may have already followed. Or if we have evidence of an effect, we can infer what the cause must have been based on the fact that over and over in the past, we observe a certain kind of cause going with a certain kind of effect. And then we also talked about how, another kind of basis for evidence is just when we see certain kinds of traits always going together or never going together or mostly going together. And so these are two kinds of regularities. And then we also very briefly alluded to some kinds of complications. Many general claims have exceptions. All X's are Y. Well, usually, as long as there's enough oxygen, or as long as there's enough this, as long as there's enough that. So there's often exceptions and qualifications. Sometimes we're dealing with things where we just can't observe. We're not dealing with repeatable things that can be like, we can't do the thing all over again. There was this one crime that was committed. This one act was committed. And sure, we can observe a lot of crimes, and understand general patterns, but about in this particular case, because this particular crime was unique and we can't repeat it, we can't like have that same killer kill that same person over and over again, and then, on the basis of repeated observation, learn about what generally happens in exactly that case. We have to look at different kinds of crimes, but that makes it very difficult to, as I'm going to suggest here in just a second, to have as certain a knowledge or as strong a evidence as to what's really going on in individual cases as compared to what's going on in the general case. So let me show you what I have in mind by that with two criminal cases. The first one is hypothetical. The second one is real from 17 years ago or something like that. But they both involve a kind of violent crime, which I'm less wild about now that I'm preparing to talk about it than I was when I put the slides together initially, but here goes. I'm going to make a point about how it's easier to obtain evidence about general laws of nature, general happenings, than it is to obtain clear evidence about what really happened in this one unique, unrepeatable case. And this is why science is at its best when dealing with laws of nature. All equations that you've ever learned, whether it's chemical equations where you have to balance equations with reactants and products, or any kind of equation you've ever done that's involved math of any kind, algebra, statistics, whatever, or when you have mathematical laws of nature, force equals mass times acceleration, E equals mc squared, gravitational force equals the gravitational constant times the mass of the first object times the mass of the second object divided by the square of the distance between them. That's Newton's law of gravity. All these things deal with generalities, or the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. I guess that we're on really strong footing and stronger footing when we're dealing with generalities than we are when dealing with unique cases. So let me show you what I have in mind with these two kinds of cases. So here is some evidence that we can imagine an prosecuting attorney, DA, presented in a court of law to try to establish the guilt of a criminal defendant. So suppose there's been a murder, and suppose that the prosecution, the district attorney, presents evidence like this. Well, here's evidence that the victim was shot twice with a .44 caliber revolver. Suppose they recover what they claim is the weapon. They use medical evidence regarding the nature of the injuries to show that indeed the injuries of the victim are consistent with them coming from this kind of weapon, and maybe even this weapon in particular. And suppose they present records like this, like gun store records, showing that the defendant bought this particular handgun that was recovered a few days before the shooting. And suppose that the prosecution also presents evidence that the defendant and the victim were estranged lovers. They were lovers, but there was this breakup and animosity as a result. And so they have a variety of things like evidence that they present, like they share the same address for such and such a period of time. And suppose that they also somehow present evidence of a nasty breakup. Maybe it's testimony from friends and neighbors hearing them arguing. And maybe friends also testify to this, something about potential motive. The defendant is very suspicious and was maybe paranoid or whatever. It was suspected the victim had been cheating on him. And these friends talk about the jealousy and everything. And suppose we have eyewitnesses at the place where they live saying, I saw the defendant's car parked out there. I know what his car looks like because it's got this sort of different paint job or this different look or nobody else, something like that. And I saw it outside the house that night, earlier that evening. Fingerprints, okay. And then the prosecution says that therefore the defendant is guilty of committing the murder. Those three dots, by the way, mean therefore. You might see them in a logic textbook or something else. It's an abbreviation for therefore. Conclusion indicator. And all of the other pieces of evidence are premises or pieces of evidence that try to establish the truth of the conclusion, try to provide good reason for believing that the conclusion is true, which is that the defendant is guilty, and this evidence is presented either to a jury or a judge. For reasons I don't fully understand, some trials just occur where the judge makes the decisions to the jury. Okay, so a few things to note about this is, of course, that the evidence involved is fallible. So in that reflective engagement assignment where I asked you, so what is evidence anyway? Most all of you talked about the fallibility of evidence. So you maybe not have used that word, but what you said things like, well, evidence very rarely or never gives us complete certainty. It gives us pretty good reasons. And we're going to talk more about probabilities in the next couple of class periods. We already did, weeks past a little bit, but evidence makes probable a belief or the conclusion that it's presented as evidence for. And that's what we have here. We've got a lot of pieces of evidence individually. They individually, one at a time, they increase the probability, the likelihood that conclusion there at the bottom is true. But if all the prosecution had was, like, say, look at piece of evidence number 2 there, the defendant bought the revolver. If that's all they had and not all the other pieces, that's something, that's evidence. But by itself, man, you can't put someone away you can't convict someone of murder on just that basis. And similarly, any 2 of these, I think, wouldn't be enough, or probably not even 3. But altogether, I don't know how many I got listed there. 1, 2, 3, 8 or so listed. Altogether, they make a pretty good case. And it seems like if we can trust all the evidence that led up to, that stands behind each of the statements of evidence, then we can trust that they provide good support. Those statements provide good support for the statement that is the conclusion, the statement of guilt. Now, of course, we may have sometimes some doubts about the things behind the alleged evidence. For some reason, we brought up I remember now. We brought up the O.J. Simpson trial earlier this semester. Called the trial of the century at the time, but of course, those things never are the trial of the century, just the trial of those few years. 3 months' time, no one will remember that Gwyneth Paltrow has been on trial here recently. But one thing about the O.J. Simpson trial, and the key reason, maybe the key reason, I guess, he was not convicted in the criminal case is this incredibly racist guy, police officer, was the one gathering and collecting all the evidence. And also, if memory serves me correct, he wasn't, supremely careful about it. But if there's this guy who's known to have a bias against African Americans, and the accused, O.J. Simpson, is African American, that can make you wonder. That can provide some doubts. So first of all, that shows that there's evidence for the evidence, right? Each of these statements here, the first 8 statements, is a statement of evidence presented in court. Exhibit A, Exhibit B. But for each statement of evidence, we can ask, what's your evidence for that, right? So the prosecution can say that the defendant bought the revolver three days before, but what's your evidence for that evidential claim? And as I introduced it, you may remember that I talked about the evidence for the evidence along the way. I say the prosecution doesn't just say that he bought the revolver. They present receipts from the gun store where he had to show his ID and fill out an application and all that stuff. So there's evidence for the evidence, but then once you get the evidence, those 8 statements of evidence, it seems that they prove beyond reasonable doubt, and in a normal situation, they would prove beyond reasonable doubt the truth of the conclusion, but they wouldn't prove beyond possible doubt that the conclusion is true. So here's a few things to think about relating to how it doesn't prove beyond, just to highlight how it doesn't prove beyond all possible doubt that the conclusion is true. And I also want to now begin to get into the issue that I alluded to a few minutes ago concerning how we can have more certainty about general claims than particular claims. So here goes. So consider these 2 claims here. Violent crimes are more often committed by estranged lovers. Lovers where they've broken up, and very often estranged means not just no longer together. I mean, usually when that phrase is used, the connotation is there's anger, there's bitterness, someone's trying to get back together, the guy's not taking no for an answer. So think about that statement. We know that that's true. People are, this is old hat to you. When I was in college, this wasn't old hat. People really were, when I was in college, when I was your age, people were really far more worried about being the victim of a violent crime by some complete stranger. And we still see this today, but still, I still think that college students in your generation are better informed about it than college students in my generation. When we were in college, it's more commonly told to you and talked about how you're a whole lot more likely to be, if something bad is going to happen, it's going to be from someone you know. It's going to be like targeted. There's that thing that you did to them, or at least they think you did to them. That's going to be the basis for it. Okay, so we can know with a whole lot of certainty that that first statement is true. And note that it's general rather than particular. Violent crimes in general. Crimes, plural, right? We're talking about a whole set. In this general set, more often committed by people that are pretty up close to you, or at least were up close to you before the breakup. But now consider this claim, this next claim. This is not a general claim. It's a claim that's very specific and particular. This estranged lover committed this particular crime. So no matter how much evidence the prosecution presents to a jury, the men and women sitting there on the jury who are listening to the prosecution's evidence, I feel like most all the time, they can never be as certain that this particular defendant committed this particular crime. I don't think they can be as certain of that as they can be certain about the general pattern. So I'm presenting a couple of examples here, and I just want you to just consult your intuitions, and I'm hoping that your gut feeling will just resonate in the way that my gut is resonating with these claims. My gut just tells me, when I consider those two statements with the two blue dots in front of them, my gut just immediately tells me, oh yeah, I can totally see how we can have a higher credence, have a higher credence in the first statement than the second. We can be more confident that it's true, even if we're very confident of both. The general thing is just easier to know. Here's just another brief example of that, and we'll move on to something else after this, but here's another general claim. In general, fingerprints on murder weapons are more likely those of innocent people. That's right. And again, we have a particular claim that follows. This particular person's fingerprints, the defendant's, were found on the murder weapon because he committed this crime. Not just because he owned it, the gun. Just showing that he bought the gun 3 days before, that doesn't show guilt. It shows ownership, or at least ownership 3 days ago anyway. But this second claim has a lot of specificity to it. And so, again, I think the first dotted claim in this pair, fingerprints on murder weapons are more commonly associated with the murderers than just innocent people. That's like a truism. It's so obviously true. It's like, well, duh. It hardly needs stating. The next statement, our fourth bulleted point there, the bottom statement, isn't a truism that's like obvious, like duh. It's a thing where it can be hard to actually know. And this is actually pervasive. So I mentioned a few examples like this concerning global warming and evolution and Big Bang Theory and a bunch of other things. These deal with unique events. Humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor from about 7 million years ago. We're not descended from chimpanzees, but we share a common ancestor. But this divergence of us from other apes, that happened once, just once, unrepeatable. And anytime you have a just once, you're going to have a controversy, and then you throw in the social world and political ideology. It's going to be a big mess. I guess I could have mentioned the January 6th riot. former UB philosophy major, was one of the convicted rioters. Go Bulls. And we can come to know general things about people who storm Capitol buildings with far more certainty than we can come to know about these particular people on this particular day doing these particular things. And again, how you view that, that's just true in general. But then I brought up that example just now because how people view that event and what its meaning, its significance is, of course, shaped by their political views, which we can't agree upon. And that just adds to our inability to know with certainty what really went down. I think we know an awful lot about that, about January 6, 2021, but not, we can't know as much as we can about general things, general happenings. So we've all seen crime shows, movies where something has happened and the investigators, Sherlock Holmes, CSI, whatever it is, they're gathering evidence. The superheroes, the sleuths, the teen sleuths are on the case, gathering clues, and someone in the show says, someone in the show is like developing a theory. I think so and so did it. I think it was the butler. And then someone else in the show is like, oh yeah? Well, what about this? And the what about bit is supposed to indicate the possibility that the evidence could really maybe initially seem like it was the butler, but in fact, it was the gardener or something else. And all this what about talk, as we all know from these movies, is sort of indicating that whatever evidence is produced, usually, is fallible. It only indicates some degree of probability that the butler did it, that the so-and-so did it. Hollywood movies tie up things a little too neatly in the end, and make it seem like it's totally clear and certain who done it. And too many, of course, shows do that as well. And in a lot of criminal cases, it is pretty clear. But of course, in a lot of criminal cases, it is less clear. Things are neat and tidy some of the times in the real world, but they're not as neat and tidy as often as they are in Hollywood movies and a lot of our shows. So here's just an example of a real case where a defendant is accused of murder, and the prosecution has a super strong case against him, and he's going to try to use the fact that the prosecution's evidence is fallible. It doesn't guarantee the truth of the claim that he's guilty. It makes it pretty probable, but in that space left over, that space where just maybe he didn't do it, he thinks he can find space for an alibi. And what we're going to see here is he grants a lot to the prosecution, claiming that they're right about a whole lot of stuff. Oh yeah, sure, you're right about this, you're right about that, but that doesn't mean I really did the murder. And hopefully it'll be just a vivid way of representing what we kind of already know and already see from movies and just things we know in real life. But here it goes. So in May 2006, this guy Douglas Dyer's married girlfriend is killed, and he's accused. Married girlfriend as in married to someone else. So she is shot fatally twice in the middle of the back and once through her hand this way. And he grants that it's his rifle that did the shooting. The prosecution establishes that it's his rifle. The prosecution establishes that he was holding it. He agrees that the prosecution is correct. He was holding it when it went off 3 times. But he claims he didn't actually murder her. So here's how he tries to go about constructing an alibi in the space allowed by the fallibility of the prosecution's evidence. So he says he originally was depressed and suicidal, intended to kill himself, and his girlfriend comes along and sees him with the gun and knows that he's suicidal. He's talking about killing himself, and she's like, no, baby, I love you, don't do it. And in the middle of all this, she grabs the gun, somehow putting her hand over the barrel of the rifle, but because he's holding a rifle, and when people, someone's holding a rifle, and I know there's a struggle over it, these things can go off sometimes. He claims that's what happened. She shot this direction through her hand, through the palm of her hand, only because, through no fault of his own, but only because she grabbed the gun to say, uh, don't commit suicide. Okay? So then she gets spooked by the fact that she's just been shot and the gun has gone off, and so she runs out the door. And he follows her, saying something like, wait, baby, I love you. Let's make it work. But as he's following her out the door, he bumps into the door, he says. And this makes the gun go off again. Now, it doesn't just make the gun go off again, it makes the gun go off again and hit her in the precise middle of her back. Okay, so we've already had her shot being. He admits that he was holding the gun and that it went off while he was holding the gun the first time she shot through her hand. He's admitting that here too. He was holding the gun while it went off, while it shot her precisely in the middle of her back. It didn't just go off and, shoot anywhere, in the bushes or whatever. Then he says, okay, remember there's 3 shots fired here. His body flinched, from the recoil from the shot, from first banging into the gun, and so like bangs into like the door frame / wall. It's hard to even say. Makes the rifle accidentally fire again. Again, it doesn't just accidentally fire again. It's a direct hit. Yeah, he's convicted. So what happens here is, mercy, I need less violent cases for my slideshow. I really dislike using this case now, and I'm not going to use it ever again. But I'll stick with it for now. So, is the prosecution's evidence fallible? Yes. But is his alibi, his version of events, plausible? No. So, and this is based just on regularity. So I just wanted to bring it back to regularities. The reason why his story is so implausible, yeah, what I said earlier about it can be really hard to know in particular cases, unique, unrepeatable events, exactly which causal factors contributed how much to the eventual outcome. Yeah. But we can know that his story sounds like total crap because of our knowledge of generalities. So when someone is shot through the hand this way, think about. This is why I don't like this case, and I'm not going to use it again. I don't like sort of imagining this happening. But here goes. This is a defensive wound. Someone who gets shot in the hand this way is doing this, right? They're under threat, and they put their hands up in front of their face. And that's why they get shot that way. People who get shot in the back, what's happening when people get shot in the back? Most every time, they're running away. They're fleeing from a perceived threat. So each of the shots involve, if you just look at all the regularities of all the time that someone gets shot in the hand like that, it is totally possible, yes, for you to sort of grab a gun and it to accidentally go off. No malice intended. But it looks for all the world like they look like defensive wounds. So first of all, I just wanted to highlight technically. So first of all, Dyer's sort of stupid alibi highlights the fact that the prosecution's evidence doesn't prove beyond all possible doubt. Because that he did it, that he murdered, not just accidentally shot, but in fact murdered. But they do prove beyond all possible doubt. The prosecution's evidence proves beyond all reasonable doubt. As stupid as this story is, it's hard to give the guy credit and it's hard to feel like giving the guy any credit is even halfway right. But he's right that his story of events is possible. And think about it. Is it possible for things to go down like that? So yeah, we see this all the time in implausible events happen in movies, and then someone gets caught holding the gun and like, no, I swear I didn't do it, and they get arrested. That's a plot line of many a sitcom or movie. So is it possible? Yes. Okay. That it was all an accident, all 3 shots right at her. Yeah. Uh, that possibility just shows the fallibility. It's not a 100% guarantee that the prosecution's evidence doesn't provide a 100% guarantee of the truth that he committed murder. So that's one thing I wanted to use the story for. It just highlights a possibility to the contrary, even if it's a stupid, implausible possibility. But then also, the reason why we know his alibi is stupid is, again, because of our knowledge of regularities, which, as we've said, is the basis of all evidential claims. Okay, so let's move on to another point about evidence. So, all knowledge of evidence is based on knowledge of patterns. All evidence is grounded in patterns. Ideally, it's patterns where we get to observe both the cause and the effect. But with some things, we only observe the effect and we reason to causes, like with the Big Bang and evolution, or design arguments for the existence of God. We see creation. We see complexity in creation. We didn't see a divine being, a divine creator, making all this stuff. We see only the effect, the creation, the resultant creation, not the initial act of creation, if there were one. But creation arguments, creationist arguments for the existence of God, try to get us to infer from the observed effect back to the cause. And just like arguments about evolution and Big Bang and any kind of unique event can be controversial for various reasons, global warming, creationist arguments are controversial, not just because they involve a supernatural being, but also because they involve this thing. It's a unique, unrepeatable event. We can't just repeatedly observe the cause leading to the effect and then do it all over again. The same cause leading to effect. We only have the effect, and we can only go back to the cause. So ideally, we see the whole pattern all the way from the cause to the effect over and over again, but we don't always get to. And as we said in class, sometimes we have to make decisions and draw conclusions when we have incomplete apprehension of what pattern or patterns there may be. And sometimes this goes pretty well. So human pattern matching abilities is just really super, but fallible. So I want to go over a few kinds of cases where our pattern matching abilities fall into error. I don't think they fall into error all the time or even most of the time, but it's useful to think about just a few kinds where they do fall into error so that we can be better reasoners about evidence and patterns. Okay. So here's a few, some examples that I want to talk about now. I want to talk about how bias or ideology clouds our minds into thinking there's a real pattern there. They're like, oh, I see a pattern of this bad stuff from the other side. And maybe you may very well see such a pattern, but you might not. It may just be your bias or your ideology, your motivated reasoning that's making you think that. So I want to talk about a few examples like that. And we all know that bias can cloud our minds. It's just helpful, I think, to go through some concrete cases illustrating this in the context of our current discussion. And there's something else I want to talk about for just a little bit, and that's how you don't even have to be biased to let things cloud your minds. Just expecting things to be one way, having an expectation that things are going to go a certain way or turn out a certain way, that by itself can have a surprisingly profound effect on what we actually see. So I'm going to use a case from the history of science there. And then we'll talk about the law of small numbers. It's not really a law. It's just it concerns small samples and big samples. We all know the large samples are better. We all know that. But not everybody really knows all the particular ways in which small samples are bad. And so I just want to talk about that for a minute, because small samples give the illusion of you seeing a real pattern of a particular kind. But in fact, either there's no pattern at all, or if there is a pattern, it's meaningless because your sample size is so small. And although we've really ingrained it into people's heads that you need large samples for a lot of stuff, the way the human mind is constructed, just innately constructed, we tend to want to jump to conclusions. We tend to want to form the judgment that we see a pattern far too soon on far too little evidence. So I want to talk about that for just a little bit. So here's one example. I briefly just kind of alluded to this along the way a few weeks ago. Don't remember everything I said about it at the time. But I did mention that there is this thing that I think it's just my opinion. Remember how we talked about it seems okay to everybody is okay to everybody except my colleague Ryan Muldoon. If I say, well, this is just my opinion, but it's my opinion that there's a particular kind of way that liberal commitments sort of cloud liberal judgments. And what I mentioned a couple of weeks ago is too much of the time, I think, when a certain kind of progressive liberal sees a disparity in the percentage of men and women in some area, the percentage of certain ethnicities in some area, uh, queer, cis, trans, whatever representation, um, to the liberals sort of, I think, stereotypically, and I think the stereotype is often it's a very real thing. It just really happens. They sort of jump way fast to the conclusion that there was an injustice there. Like there was kind of an intentional injustice and somebody's to blame. And very often that's the case. I mean, as we talked about in our last class period, um, a key part of American history is slavery, racism. We didn't talk about sexism, but of course that's part of our history as well, and much else. Okay, so very often, yeah, there is this the patterns where there's not representation in some group that reflects the proportions of people of color or people of this or that persuasion in the larger population. Very often it does reflect active disenfranchisement, active exclusion from full participation in democracy, in education, in whatever it is, business. Okay. Anyway, a couple months ago, I have not gotten very many Twitter arguments. I don't spend a lot of time on Twitter. uh, Twitter revenues are down 89% since Musk took over. But anyway, revenues from advertisers. Okay, someone produced a list here of the top 20 most productive authors in the small field that I work in. You can see I'm number what, 11? Okay, I'm not really the number 11th most productive person in that field. So the person who first produced this list, they produced it's a bad list. And I even said on Twitter that, I kind of feel sorry for the way that everybody is just like dragging these people through the mud. They're kind of, the two people that wrote the study are kind of amateurs. Ah, nothing wrong with being amateur. I think people should have gone easier on them. In any case, I think that the list is wrong for a variety of reasons. Anyway, but I want to get in an argument with this one guy, Javier. Don't know the guy. He's replying to Killjoy 1941. That would be me. I mean, it's just bonkers how all the top publishers in this thing, experimental philosophy, that's just where philosophers gather data, like I do. They're all white men. And I'm not going to include the whole conversation, but he went on to make claims about there being some injustice. That this must show that this very small area of philosophy must actively exclude women and people of color. Whew, anyway, and he's just totally. I don't know. The truth of my claim that he's wrong isn't what's relevant here. What's most important here is that you see the kind of pattern, and Javier could very well be right, and I'm wrong, and you could still understand the general lesson, the main lesson. And the main lesson is, he's jumping too quickly to the conclusion. So a better list of people who do work in experimental philosophy that some other people have been working on producing, and who are the most influential people producing the most influential research. According to these other lists, it's about equal men and women. I haven't seen demographic breakdowns in other areas, but just take the men and women thing. We got a bunch of dudes here on this one list. You see 15 out of this top 20, all dudes. It was not a well constructed list. Um, but even if it were sort of okay in the way that it was put together and constructed, it's a small field. And I don't know, I've been in it part of it from the very beginning. I found everyone who's biased thinks they're not biased, right? So I think I'm not biased. But no, I really am not, I think. But I hosted the only annual conference in experimental philosophy in North America for many years. I was the founding editor of the only book series there's ever been in experimental philosophy. It's a small field. And man, it's warm and welcoming. It's all because the number one guy on the list, Josh. So you can see Javier is replying something about, oh, okay, Josh is great, blah, blah, blah. He's replying to me because I'm just going on and on about the guy who coined the term experimental philosophy, who first made t-shirts for the movement, who had his indie rocker wife make us a music video that's totally kick-ass, who put the whole movement together and has organized everything, and is the nicest guy, and he's so nice it creeps people out. A retired colleague of mine, Carolyn Korsmeyer, when she first met Josh Knobe in 2005, she's like, no one can really be that nice. No, he's actually that nice. He's so nice, it's weird, but it's real. And when that guy's the head of the movement, I don't know. I would like for you to take my word for it that there's not bias. But anyway, even if you don't think this case is established, um, um, I think we can all get the sense that sometimes people think they see a pattern too quickly, and they're really their ideology is doing the talking. Here's a couple of other examples. So this one was, I don't know, picking on lefties. Here's some picking on some righties here. Okay, so this is a T-shirt in the boys section of Target. This is a red T-shirt, and we've got two pieces of construction equipment, like a crane, I guess both, I don't know, crane type things, right? And one is holding up a rainbow, the other is holding up a cloud, and they're all smiley. Do you see the problem though? Do you see the problem with selling a boys T-shirt with construction equipment on it? Well, if you don't, let Michelle enlighten you. She is canceling Target. Now, of course, she doesn't fully explain her reasons, but we can guess, right? Uh, and in the rest of her post, you can tell that she's a good bit to the right. So of course, what that means that she's objecting to is the rainbow, which, of course, the gay folks didn't invent. They didn't invent glitter either, however much they may use of it. But what she sees here is one piece of a larger puzzle, like wokeism run amok. They want to come and groom. They're coming for all our kids to groom all of them. They want to make them all queers. Okay. I know. I hope we can agree that. Yeah, I know. Just look at that kid's T-shirt. It's just it's a happy, smiley preschool kid's T-shirt. It's not obviously a T-shirt for in the 15-year-old boys section of boys clothing of Target, right? It's like it's like first grade. Here's one more. A little bit picking on the righties again. These two just happened to come across my social media feed on the same day this past week, and they both concern Target. I don't know. Anyway. So here we have the latest version of Clue, the board game Clue, which is not, of course, not a very interesting board game at all. And we've got all these characters, and we've got Angela, who's apparently a kind of. I looked her up. She's trying to make a name for herself. Okay. So we've got all these characters, and they look different than the old ones. Not even your favorite childhood games are safe from the woke barf. Wokeism rung amok. So here we've got lesbian chef. Okay. So right, there's someone who seems to be presenting as a woman sitting on the green sort of couch with the chef's jacket. And how do we know she's a lesbian? Well, she's got Doc Martens, and part of her hair is cut sort of close to the side. And there's something to, buzz cut types of things and lesbianism, being lesbian. Those things go together. It's somewhat butchy. Okay. And then we have Senator replica of Senator knee pads in her strong independent woman pantsuit. So this is referring to, it wasn't immediately obvious to me who this was referring to. I had to kind of look, but okay. It's the lady right in the middle of the board game picture, all in blue. And I won't go into the details, but the knee pads thing is a whole reference to certain women in the U.S. Senate and some discussions that have happened in recent years about the kind of sexual harassment they've had to deal with. But Angela's objecting to this, weirdly, is objecting to the fact that there looks to be a strong, independent woman in the pantsuit in the middle. Like, that's bad. She doesn't have, okay, fine, you don't like, if Angela doesn't like dykey haircuts, okay, fine. Lady in the middle, that's just traditional, she's just traditional pants. Oh my God. Anyway, but somehow there's something strong, independent woman in a pantsuit is still part of the larger piece of the puzzle of wokeism run amok and being shoved down our throats. Okay, so then over on the far side, we've got this kind of African American looking fella, and there's supposed to be only, as she says, you'll notice, one straight white heterosexual character. Okay, so that means, okay, so the lady in red, not white. This means that the guy in green in the back must be gay. Now just take a look at him. How do we know that he's gay? I know you can't see it very well. It's small. It's not great resolution. It's just a guy who's got combed hair and a nice jacket. I don't know. I'm a straight guy. I like pretty clothes. Anyway, but so the only straight white hetero guy is the white bearded man. But of course, that too is going to be disappointing because you notice who he's next to. Is he with a white lady? No. Make it stop. Everything woke turns to shit. Okay. So in any case, just a couple quick examples. You know, we can pick on people from all sides. But the example here is supposed to be is if evidence is a matter of perceiving patterns and saying, oh, I know there's a pattern here. So if I've observed A, there's going to be a B nearby, maybe as an effect, maybe as a cause, or as at least something correlated, something related. And too often people rush to judgment, rush to the conclusion that they see a pattern. We see Angela thinks she sees a pattern here of wokeism run amok. Now it is true that there is a good bit of diversity here. Okay. We do have different skin colors. So we've got two people that you might present as African American, I might call, I don't know, initially want to classify as African American using our very simple-minded categories. But you'll notice they are different hues and tones, right? The guy with the glasses is rather light skinned, and the woman in red is rather dark. There's a kind of diversity, and maybe that does go with a kind of diversity. That does go with a kind of diversity push, instead of everybody just being white and old versions of Clue. Okay, we've got something different. But it's not. It doesn't. I don't. And I guess as I'm thinking about it, even right now on top of my feet, maybe you could push back a little bit and defend Angela a little bit. It just struck me that there's only a little bit of diversity, but it's not like wokeism run amok. But again, even if you don't agree with me about a particular example concerning this box of Clue, I think we can appreciate what the larger message is going to be, and that is that people think they see an awful lot of patterns, and many times they do, but many times they don't. We don't need to pause too long on Colin Kaepernick, but what do you see here? What's the pattern that you see here? For many people, it's disrespecting the flag, disrespecting our veterans, because our veterans own the flag somehow. Okay. Or what you see here is a guy doing what he says he's doing, and that's protesting police brutality against African Americans. Okay, but just another example of what pattern it is that we see. We don't all see the same pattern. What pattern we see can be controversial. So let me turn to some other examples that are going to be a little less familiar than this, and I think, and hopefully maybe a little more instructive by virtue of being a little bit less familiar. Let's see. So here's a question: do male and female musicians play differently, like the violin, the cello, um, brass instruments, wind instruments, percussion, just by virtue of being male and female? So here's an example from the 90s. This is a little bit dated, but it's dated because it concerns a time when the classical music world was changing. And Mr. Hollander here, director of the Vienna State Opera, is a staunch representative of the old guard. Women are not appropriate for more masculine instruments. So any sort of a brass instrument, so anything that's big, basically. You want to play some dinky little frou-frou little piccolo, ladies? Okay, fine, go ahead. But a big bass, or even a cello, it's a little big for you ladies, Mr. Hollander is going to think. Or the bigger brass instruments. So the larger the brass instrument, the more metal there is involved, metal tubing there is involved. The bigger the mouthpiece. So a tuba will have a bigger mouthpiece than a trombone, which will have a bigger mouthpiece than a trumpet. But even a trumpet requires a lot of breath support, and so is therefore very masculine, according to Mr. Hollander. He just doesn't want women in there at all. Okay. And here's Mr. Hollander saying the following things. There are indeed differences that nature has made between man and woman. Naturally, these differences have an effect on musical performance. Naturally, there are different lung constellations. Women are weak, is what he means. Naturally, there are different mouth constructions. Female lips, weak. That's what he means. Okay. It's just a fact. This is a fact. He's not racist, sexist. He's just reporting the facts here, he says. Nature has made us differently. He didn't make nature do things that way. The slides I'm going to focus on here do focus just on gender, but he is racist too. So he also thinks that, so for example, violins were invented in the West. So if you're Japanese, any kind of Asian, and you want to play the violin, he thinks, yeah, I mean, you may be pretty good for a high school orchestra. I mean, maybe, or a second-rate college orchestra. But, it's a Western instrument. And if you're Asian, you're not Western. It's just really not suited to you. And he's wrong about all this stuff. So, like I said, it's a little bit dated, but I use the dated example because this was a time when things, as I said a minute ago, were changing in the classical music world. So in response to protests, finally, he agreed to force the orchestra. So he didn't want to allow women to audition for the orchestra. But all the dudes who 100% populated the orchestra, playing all the instruments there, they didn't want ladies either. So he's not just some lone sexist. I mean, he's just the head sexist among all the sexists. Okay. The conductor of the New York Philharmonic says, I just don't think women should be in an orchestra in any capacity. They're not even strong enough to play the weak little dinky sissy instruments. Okay. All right. So what happened around this time is, as you saw, there were some protests, and people began to push for symphony auditions to now be made behind curtains. And this is now how things are done, like the Buffalo Philharmonic and everybody else. So there's a panel of judges who listen to you play, and they can't see you. Importantly, they should not be able to hear you walk. So a man's dress shoe has a heavy clunk to it and sounds different to it than a woman's high heel. So they need to not be able to hear footsteps of any kind. So you're required to either wear something like soft-soled shoes, and then there's carpet and cushioning, so that's taken away. If you clear your throat before you play your cello, well, you've given away what your vocal cords, your throat, your chest cavity sounds like. You can give away gender very often, or maybe size. I mean, if you just have a bigger chest cavity, clearing your throat is just going to resonate bigger. You're just like, violins and cellos are hollow, so the sound to resonate in the middle. Your lungs, your upper chest cavity is a resonant chamber. So what happens is if you sit down to play your cello, you walked quietly, softly on your soft shoes on the soft, carpet over to your chair, and you accidentally clear your throat and the judges hear it. You have to leave and start the whole thing over again. And you're only assigned a number. They don't know that you're Caitlin versus Maximus, who's auditioning for this cello spot, this cello opening for a cello player that they have at the Buffalo Philharmonic. Your musician number, 875 or something like that. All right, so Mr. Hollander did allow women to begin to audition for the Vienna Philharmonic, and which accompanies the opera that he directs, but they don't use curtains. Oh, and curtains too, of course, block your ethnicity and size. So I started to go hunt down this picture of this particular woman that's been discussed in some things that I've read about this. So the French horn apparently takes an enormous amount of breath support to play. So you have to have a really powerful set of lungs, and one of the world's top French horn players is an exceptionally tiny woman, and so she looks small. And in fact, her lungs are probably in fact small, just smaller than the average person, certainly smaller than a largest person. And so if you see her and you let what you see color what you expect to hear too much, then you're going to say, oh, she's not going to be able to blow hard enough from that thing. The French horn is the one, it's got skinny mouthpiece and then whoosh, a bunch of loops, and then finally the bell. You're going to think she doesn't have the breath support to play that thing properly. She does. Far more breath support than you'll ever have. Far stronger lungs than you'll ever have. She's just little. Okay. So the curtains hide all these irrelevant factors. It doesn't matter how tall she actually is. She's trying out she's a professional musician, so her job is to produce a certain sound, not a certain look. I mean, if you're a model or, I don't know, an actor or whatever, then yeah, you gotta have, there's a look component to that. Okay, but not just sitting in an orchestra. And again, they can't tell if you're Asian, they can't tell how young you are, whatever. If you look old and decrepit and wrinkled, but you're still strong as heck, all those wrinkles could count against you, but when you're behind the curtain, you get a fair shake. So here's just one study, one of the many studies that have been conducted around the time. Auditions for orchestras when conducted behind screens. This particular study just focused on American women, but there's other studies that focus on people worldwide. The screen, there's different rounds to the audition, right? A whole bunch of people come in to show up for that one cello spot, one cello opening in the Buffalo Philharmonic, and they narrow it down to the top, I don't know what it is, 10, the top 3 or something like that. There's different rounds, it gets narrowed down. But by virtue of being behind the screen, a woman's chance of moving from the first round to the second is increased by 50%. And then to move from semifinalist to finalist, or finalist to actually get the job, you look at these final rounds, a woman's chance of actually getting the job or moving on to the final rounds is increased by 300%. Okay, so what this shows, of course, is that sexists like Ian Hollander, the director of the Vienna Opera, which works with the Vienna Philharmonic, is simply wrong. And the other people that I quoted there on a previous screen, they're simply wrong in thinking that women just can't do the job, or Asians, or little people, or whatever. And the screen proves it. Women wouldn't be so much more successful behind a screen than they were when there were no screens, if all the previous judges were just going on sound alone, which they claimed they were. But the thing that's one thing that I wanted to focus about this. So there's a few things that I want to focus on. So one conclusion is just this is an illustration of how people think they see a pattern and they don't, and the curtains prove them wrong. Here, I guess I should say they think they hear a pattern rather than see a pattern. They think they hear that men really are better these sexist guys from the old guard, they really do think that men really are better at every instrument in the orchestra, period, than any woman, could ever be. And the screen just shows that to be wrong. They thought they saw a pattern, but they're mistaken. But here's a second thing I want to mention, though, is there's two different ways you could interpret the way the sexist guys view female cello players. One is that their own ears really are telling them that the woman is just as good as the man. Suppose there's two finalists for the job. And our principal cello player at Buffalo Philharmonic, Roman, big, huge bear of a guy, is just fabulous. I don't even like classical music, but man, I could listen to this guy a lot. Suppose Roman's leaving. Got two finalists for principal cello, BPO, a man and a woman. And suppose they're equally good. So one possibility is that a sexist like Ian Hollander, when listening to the two finalists, the man and the woman, one possibility is that his ears really tell him that the woman is just as good as the man, but he goes ahead and thinks she's worse anyway. He goes ahead and says she's worse anyway. He's already made up his mind before he's heard anything that she's going to be worse, so he doesn't really listen. But to the degree that he actually is listening, his ears really are telling him that she is as good. He's just ignoring what he's listening to. He's ignoring her goodness that's really coming into his ears. And that does happen some. But what's very interesting about all these studies that they show is, I think they suggest that the right conclusion is this. Ian is actually hearing something different. His sexism pervades his mind to such a degree that when he hears the woman cello playing and he knows it's the woman, he actually hears worse sounds. His subjective experience is actually changed by the fact that he knows that's a woman he's hearing, and it's changed when he knows it's a man, or particularly a big man, like I said, Roman was. He sees, oh, big, burly Russian fella. Yes, that's what we need. He's a principal cellist. The thing about it is, it's not just that it helps him make up his mind in the sexist direction. It changes his experience. Here's just a study that sort of briefly shows using an fMRI machine. This is not music, but just briefly shows how it provides another brief case of how expectation can cloud our minds. But we have some neuroimaging data to suggest what I think is the right hypothesis, and that is that people's subjective experiences are really completely shaped and colored and saturated by their bias. So there's little old me from 2008, back when blogs were first invented and cool, and I invented a wine and cheese blog, and I wrote about the following story. I was so young and unjaded and uncynical, and those days are long gone. So here's what happened. I blogged in 2008 about this particular fMRI study. So some volunteers were laying down in an fMRI machine which measures levels of activation in different brain regions. And MRI, without the F, is a structural MRI. It just tells you what structures are there. So if someone is looking for cancer, which is a structure, you do an MRI. fMRI is functional. It looks for function, doings, activations. Okay, so these people are drinking wine while laying down an expensive brain scanner. Okay. They were told they were sampling 5 different wines. They were really just 3 wines. But 2 of them were presented twice. So one's presented once, 2 presented twice. And while laying down, they're not allowed to move, but they are sort of shown, oh look, here's the label. Fancy French looking label and fancy expensive price tag. They're shown a price tag for wine number 1, and they drink it and they sample, and okay, so a bunch of different people. Their brains are scanned while they're enjoying each sample of each wine, and so unsurprisingly, the one that is given the cheapest price tag, regardless of what the actual market value is, the researchers are intentionally manipulating the price tags that these people see. But the one with the cheapest price tag is given the lowest rating. Oh, I didn't enjoy this very much. It's too dry, too something, too strong. Yeah, it's not mine. But the one that's most expensive, they thought, oh, that's the highest. That's a little bit unsurprising. We know this kind of thing happens. But here's the thing that's less surprising. No, wait, no, sorry. Here's the thing that's more surprising that is not so commonsensical that we couldn't have figured out without sophisticated brain imaging technique. Okay, so fMRI machines can detect when uh, levels of your brain that involve working memory are activated, have greater activation than your sort of baseline level, like where you put on your thinking cap. Oh, let me concentrate on that. So there's these regions that involve um, attention, executive control, and yeah, reasoning, working memory. Um, there's emotional centers of your brain. When some bunch of philosophers, experimental philosophers, give people like trolley cases, which you may have heard of, while scanning their brains. And would you push the big guy off the footbridge to make his body fall down in front of the trolley and stop it, and he'll get smashed all to bits. But by being smashed all to bits, it'll make the trolley come to a halt, and he won't kill the other 5 people. Would you be willing to lay your hands on that guy and push him off the bridge? So people are asked questions about this, and we see that most of the people who say no, I wouldn't push him off the bridge, they have increased levels of activation in regions of the brain associated with emotional knee-jerk responses like, oh, no way. And these same people who are unwilling to push the big guy off the bridge have decreased levels of activation in regions of the brain devoted to working memory. So in other words, they're not reasoning about it. They're just emotionally reacting like, oh. But the people are like, well, it would stink to push the guy off the bridge, but it would save 5. So, oof, I would hate fun. And just the idea of putting my hands on him sounds terrible. Oh, I think I should go ahead and do it though, because it's 5 people. It's out of control. Okay. When you scan these people's brains, they have higher activation in reasoning areas of their brain, working memory, attention, and so on, and decreased levels of activation in emotional knee-jerk response areas. Okay, so we can learn all sorts of things. So this suggests that the people who are willing to push the guy off the bridge, much of the time, really actually are reasoning more, and the other folks are reasoning less in just going with emotion. Okay, so we can detect differences in levels of activation of different brain regions, where we know what the functions of those brain regions are, can tell us things. And so here what we find is we know what the pleasure centers of the brain are. So in the wine study, back to the wine, remember there's 2 wines that are presented twice. Each of these 2 wines is presented with a high price tag and a low price tag. Each time the very same wine is presented with a higher price tag, there's greater levels of activation in pleasure centers of the brain than when those same 2 wines were presented with lower price tags. There's lower levels of activation in pleasure centers in the brain. What does that mean? They didn't just think the more expensive wine tasted better. It actually subjectively felt differently. There was, in fact, more pleasure inside when there was a price tag. The 2 wines, see, it's not that the same wine with 2 price tags tasted the same, and they just called it better when it had the higher price tag. The taste experience was changed. It was a different experience. It was a more positive, more pleasurable experience of drinking the very same wine. So this is what so studies like this and others are what make me think that we can draw some conclusions about what Ian Hollander and other sexists in the music world are actually experiencing. I would have to, of course, provide more data than this, but I think there is more data that could be provided. Our expectations, our biases, our prejudices, they really cloud what we see to a surprisingly strong degree. And so is there really the pattern there? A pattern of this wine really being better? These wines being better than those 2 wines? No, it's the same pair. There's no real pattern. But the price tags lead us to have an expectation of a certain kind. It leads us to expect something better if it's more expensive. And then our subjective experience really can be colored in very surprising ways. Okay. So our next example about how expectations can color our mind, cloud our minds, maybe I should have said color or cloud our minds, comes from the discovery of penicillin by this fella, this rather not so socially smooth looking fella. Okay, let's try not to pick on him too much though. Okay, so he did discover the world's first antibacterial, the world's first miracle drug. And he discovered it in 1928 and got the Nobel Prize in Medicine for this a little bit later. So here we see on an agar plate, we see bacteria that's been, like a bacteria in like a solution. Someone has taken and like painted the bacteria like with a paintbrush. You can see the brush strokes on the agar plate. And we've got 5 spots. So those are penicillium molds. Penicillium, I believe, is a genus. And the medicine penicillin is just from one particular kind of penicillium. The blue and blue cheese, that's another kind of penicillium mold. You can read all about it on my blog from 2008. So it turns out that penicillium, well, certain kinds of penicillium molds release a substance around them that kills bacteria. So those halos, people call them, circles around the black dots, is just an empty space where there are nutrients on the agar plate. So the whole circle thing has got nutrients for bacteria to feed on, but it's only growing in the yellowish bit parts. And then the black bits are, that's the mold. And then what is that, aqua greenish bluish thing? Circles, the halos. There's just no bacteria growing near the penicillium. So here's just an interesting case about how a pattern can actually be staring us in the face and we not recognize it. So the earlier patterns that I was going with were things like this. People think there's a pattern of wokeism run amok, a pattern of I don't know what all. A pattern of women just being bad at music, worse than men, when in fact there's no such pattern. Here's a case where there is a very clear pattern that was staring people in the face for ages and they failed to recognize it. So it's like the opposite, flip side of the same coin, but it's similar in what's causing the blindness, the misperception, lack of correct perception, and that's people's expectations. So the most famous story about this comes from someone who, not Fleming, the guy who discovered penicillin and won the Nobel Prize and all that stuff, but a bunch of people began talking like as soon as they realized that penicillium molds, the blue and blue cheese and things like that, is antibacterial. Okay, sorry, cousin of blue cheese mold, is antibacterial. People all of a sudden started realizing that, wait a minute, that's been looking at us in the face all along. So the penicillin was discovered in 1928, and one guy at the time, his story just became famous, this Hilding fella. He didn't win a Nobel Prize, but he's like, man, years ago, we all knew that, and we didn't see it. So here I am, I'm undergrad med school. I know undergrad med school sounds weird, but undergrad law major was never a thing at UB till just, a couple of years ago. Getting a law degree, studying law was only something you did after you're an undergraduate, but now at UB, and it's a very new thing that you can do as an undergrad. So it's like that. He's undergrad medical, whatever, pre-med fella. Okay. Well, he's got an agar plate with black spots and all that stuff, and he gets scolded by his instructor. He's like, "Hey, instructor, why is there no bacteria growing there?" And he's like, "You're careless. You suck, and you weren't careful." And your plate got contaminated. Now he's in a bacteriology class. Okay. He and others in the medical profession and medical research begin to reflect, now wait a minute, we've seen this happen. It's not just like Hilding's science lab back in the day. Like everybody, like people everywhere, we've seen this happen all along. And why are we doing bacteriology anyway? Why are people in med school studying bacteriology? They're trying to figure out how they could possibly kill the bacteria, how they could possibly create the world's first antibacterial, and they've not done it yet. Okay, so there had been hundreds who had done the same thing, but none of them asked the perfectly obvious question: if there's something about these molds which prevents bacterial growth, might this also prevent infection in man? In other words, be an antibacterial. And people immediately began wondering why didn't this occur to any of us? And so the mold was clearly killing bacteria, and no one thought that they had discovered a thing that could kill bacteria. Got that? No one had thought they had discovered an antibacterial. Just because they had it in their head, wait a minute, mold on an agar plate, bad. Mold on an agar plate, it's been contaminated. And they just had that mentality, oh, mold bad, mold contamination. And, year after year, lab after lab, they would see bacteria being killed and still wondered how they could ever come up with the world's first antibacterial. So in case, interesting case I think it's an interesting case from the history of medical science. And I also wanted to throw it in too because it doesn't involve bias. So, right, some of the early cases, that I gave where people were thinking they perceived a certain kind of pattern but were mistaken. Well, it's because of bias was the suggestion in the early cases. But this isn't bias. This is just you just get your mind set in a particular direction. And of course, biases and prejudices do get your mind set in a particular direction. But they don't have to be like the morally problematic bias or prejudice to get your mind set and focused and to put blinders on your head. Which is why here on this slide here, Hildy mentions a high school student. He intentionally mentions a high school student because he's thinking of someone who's just intelligent and curious, but doesn't yet have the blinders on. And just, if you don't have the blinders on and you look at those plates, aren't you going to think, oh, that kills bacteria, right? Okay. All right, so these are just some examples from prejudice or expectations of how human pattern perception is fallible. So now I want to move on to what I call the law of small numbers as our last bit. So the law of small numbers is not actually a law. The law of large numbers is a law. And this is just the idea that as sample size increases, you're just going to get a better idea of what's really going on. So if I want to know what every potential voter in America thinks of Trump's indictment, in all these opinion polls that you hear, it's 1,000 people that are asked. It's not 500, it's not 2,000, it's not 3,000, it's 1,000. Regardless of whether it's nationwide, if they want to get a idea of what the nation as a whole thinks, it's 1,000 people from the nation. If they want to get an idea about what Florida voters think about Trump's indictment, it'll be 1,000 Florida voters. It's always 1,000 for various reasons. But it's not because a larger sample wouldn't be better. It would be better. It's just pollsters think that it's not worth the cost to do a 3,000, 2,000 person size sample. But is a 3,000 person size sample better than 1,000? Oh, heck yeah. But the degree to which a 2,000 person size sample is better than a 1,000 is less than the degree to which a 1,000 size sample is better than 500. Let me say that again. The degree to which a 2,000 size sample is better than 1,000 is not as much of an improvement. 2,000 is not as much of an improvement over 1,000 in terms of accuracy as 1,000 is an improvement over 500, surprisingly. You can study that in statistics. But the idea is that even if it gets maybe not worth the money to keep asking more and more people, the law of large numbers still holds true. And it just says, well, if you have enough money and time and enough employees and whatever, the larger and larger sample you're going to get, it's going to be better. And we all know that. So we all know that larger samples are better. Okay, but not everybody knows about all the ways that small samples suck. Okay. So there's one psychologist, Daniel Kahneman, the first psychologist to win the Nobel Prize in economics, kind of a hero of mine, intellectual hero of mine, and I don't have very many, nearly zero. But he coined this term as just a sort of cheeky sort of term, just to People think that small samples reflect populations, entire populations, far more accurately than they do. If you ask the average person, are larger samples better? They'll be like, oh yeah. But then they still go do dumb things with small samples. So I'm going to talk about that just for a little bit. So here's some data from some coin tosses that I simulated using an online random number generator. And this pertains to something that one of our Victorias raised a couple weeks ago. So, okay, so I'm going to toss a fair coin, and I'm going to toss it 10 times and see how many heads I get. So what's the expected proportion of heads? 50% or 0.5. Or if I toss the coin 20 times, so that's the second row. I'm going to toss that same fair coin 20 times. How many heads should I get? Well, 50%. But using my sort of online random number generator, I simulated these series of tosses, and this is what I found. So had it simulated a series of 10 tosses, and 7 out of 10 times it was heads. 3 out of times it was tails. So 70% of the time. Okay. Then I had to do a trial run of 20 tosses in a row. 60% were heads. Then I asked to do 40. Okay. 47.5%. So you'll notice that we are getting a little bit closer to 50% there, right? In fact, we do reach 50% at 60 tosses, exactly 50. I asked it to simulate a coin toss, tossing a coin 60 times, and exactly 30 were heads and exactly 30 were tails, so exactly 50. But that's just once out of all these cases, all these rows. With sample sizes less than 60, 50, 40, the proportions of the observed proportion of heads departs from the expected true proportion of 50%, far more than people think. They really expect, if I toss this coin 20 times, they really expect I'm going to get exactly 50 far more often than I do, or if it's going to be a little bit off in 50, it's only going to be off by a little bit. And they're just mistaken about how often it's off by much further than they think it would be. And noticing that even when I simulated 1,000 coin tosses, it still didn't come out to exactly 50. It's 49%. And note that larger sample sizes didn't always guarantee getting closer. So we got closer and closer. Let's move from 10 to 20 to 40 to 60, right? 70%, that's 20% off. Or is it off from the true proportion? The true expected proportion is going to be 50-50 from a truly fair coin. And these random numbers really were asked to draw a 1 or a 0. And it was truly random. But in the first round with just 10 trials in the sequence, the observed proportion is off by 20%. Expected proportion 50%, observed to 70. That's a difference of 20. And notice that the difference amount, the error, goes down. So for row 2, the difference is between 50% and 60%. Well, now we're just down we're down to 10% off. Or then row 3, 50% and 47.5%. Well, that's just 2.5% off. And then finally at 60, we're at 0% off, 0% discrepancy. But notice that increasing sample size doesn't guarantee more and more accuracy. As we move from 60 trials, 60 flips of a coin, simulated flips of a coin, to 80, we actually move away from 50. And, and then 100, that's kind of, anyway. Now, if I were to continue this out to just like, millions and billions and whatever, okay, it would get awfully stinking close to 50. Far more than just 0.49. It'll be like, 0.49, it'll be way close. But in the short run, people underestimate how far small samples are going to diverge from the true mean, the true proportion, the true value, what's really going on. So Daniel Kahneman, again, sort of my hero. My hero. Took a look at just some things several years back. Some investments made by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in his best-selling book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And So the Gates Foundation has done a lot of good things. Um, Implanted microchips and all. No, invested in education, done a lot of things. So researchers in education want to figure out, okay, what do the most successful schools have in common? Okay. And in a report that Kahneman looked at a report from the Gates Foundation and how the Gates Foundation wanted to invest in small schools, and Kahneman looked at the data and the reasons that the Gates Foundation gave for wanting to invest in small schools. And here's just one item of data that the Gates Foundation presented that Kahneman analyzed and saw some problems with. First of all, small schools are good, but we got to be clear on. We all think that small schools are good. I mean, teachers that have way too many students in the classroom, way more work than they can reasonably manage, and not enough pay and supplies or safety, or I don't know what. These are not good ideal situations for education to happen. But we need to think about how do we know that we have shown that small schools are better? Small classrooms, small schools. And by the way, this particular study focuses on small schools, not small classrooms. Those are separate things, right? You can have a big school and a small school, but in each of those schools, each teacher just has the same number of students per class. Each just has 25 third graders. It's just at lunchtime, there's just massive amounts of third graders in the lunchroom at the big school, and a whole lot less at the small. Okay, but here's one piece of data that was cited by the Gates Foundation. So 1,600 schools in Pennsylvania. They look at various measures, standardized measures of how well performing the schools are, how well the students at the school do on standardized tests, grade point average, a whole bunch of things can be factored into these things, depending upon which grade we're talking about, dropout rates. All sorts of things could be factored into what are the top performing schools, the worst performing schools, and the ones all in the middle. Okay, so the Gates Foundation noted in their report that out of the top 50 schools, 6 of them were small, which is an overrepresentation by a factor of 4, which I translated into plain English for you here. Okay. Throughout all of Pennsylvania, according to the way they operationalized small, 3% of all schools in Pennsylvania were small. Okay. 3 out of 100 is 3%, right? 3 out of 100 are small. Well, how many are in the top 50? How many small ones in the top 50? 6 out of 50. That's 12%. That's what I mean by an overrepresentation by a factor of 4. So like, holy cow, the best schools. I mean, look, the small schools are only 3% overall, but amongst the best schools, it's 12%. There's got to be something here. Okay. So I'm quoting Kahneman here. Kahneman's report on the Gates Foundation's report. These data encourage the Gates Foundation to make substantial investment in the creation of small schools, and sometimes investment by splitting the large schools into smaller units, not necessarily, and not changing the teacher to student ratio, right? Classroom size. And a lot of other charitable institutions, follow suit. Some big, enormous investor like the Gates Foundation moves one way. All the smaller or medium-sized players, tend to follow. But here's what Kahneman noticed. Kahneman just went back and looked at all the data from Pennsylvania. And he found, yep, amongst the schools in the top 50, 12% of them are small, even though 3% of schools overall are small. But he went a step further and he looked at all the schools in the bottom 50. How many of them were small? 12. It turns out exactly the same as 12%. Now the reason why has to do with large samples and small samples departing from the true, small samples departing from the true mean, and larger samples being better. So let's just think about standardized test scores. There's actually a lot of factors that people use to rate the overall performance of a school. But let's just simplify things for right now and just focus on some standardized tests, okay? A large school has a large number of people taking that one standardized test, whether it's the SAT, the PSAT, some sort of 7th or 8th grade standardized test, some Regents exam like we have in New York. Whatever it is, the large school has a large sample. So the average score of the students from the large school is going to look like the more overall average in the entire state, right? So we've got the average for concreteness. Let's just say PSAT. Let's just say PSAT. Pretend everybody's required to take it their sophomore year of high school. I don't even know, even though I'm a parent, I'm supposed to know that stuff. I don't know. Okay. Suppose everyone in Pennsylvania in every school takes the PSAT sophomore year of high school. Okay. So there's an overall Pennsylvania average across all of Pennsylvania, all sophomores in a given year for how they did on the PSAT. Okay. And then the large school, there's an average for that school for all of their sophomores. So because the large school has a larger sample size, the average PSAT score in the large school is going to be closer to the average Pennsylvania score, just because it's a larger sample. Okay, small schools have fewer sophomores taking the PSAT. So what do small samples do? They diverge from the overall general typical thing more. That's what small samples do. Like when I was flipping the coin, I just flipped it 10 times. I got 7 heads. I didn't manufacture that. I ran the trial once. I didn't keep sort of messing with the random number generator until I got a cool number that sort of showed that proved a cool point in the way that I wanted it to. I just let the random number generator do its thing once. One trial of 10, and the very first thing, and the only thing that it came across was 7 heads out of 10. Because it's a small sample, 70% heads is really easily doable with just 10 coin flips. Now with 1,000 coin flips, oh, hold on. If I'm flipping what's supposed to be a fair coin 1,000 times, and it's 70% heads, that's not a fair coin. I mean, we can know with a great deal of certainty, high credence, it's not a fair coin. But if I'm only flipping it 10 times and I get 7 out of 10, oh well, you cannot know with certainty that that's an unfair coin, biased towards heads or something like that. So the same thing is actually going on here with the small schools, just like a small string of coin flips. Just because it's a small sample, the scores can just easily go all over the place. The big sample, the scores can't just go all over the place because you're sampling so many people in any case. So small schools may be good for some reasons, but according to Kahneman, the reasons that the Gates Foundation presented was not among them, because this is he's here. The stat is about the 1662 schools in Pennsylvania. Kahneman's quoting from the Gates Foundation, but they only looked at the top 50, not the bottom 50. If they looked at the whole thing, they would have seen, oh, yeah. In any case, people think that what's happening in this, yeah. I think you get the idea. Sorry about the fumbling right there, but surprising things happen in small samples, even though we all know larger samples are better. So here's one last example, and I'll finish with this one. And at one point in class earlier this week, I had said I would talk about something called the regression to the mean. I'm just not going to go into that. This will be good enough. So here's just another example of law of small numbers at work. So in World War II, Nazis bombed London. Just bombed the hell out of it. Okay. For just months and months on end. So, and Britain was largely powerless. I don't actually know enough about World War II history anymore to know what kind of anti-aircraft guns they had, but anti-aircraft artillery they may have had, and I guess they surely had some, I guess. But what you always see from these, I don't know, movies and things is just the Nazis are coming. I guess they sure they had to have anti-aircraft artillery, but it must not have been much, because all you see is just the British people just hunkering down into bomb shelters and hoping they don't die. And I guess there is the Royal Air Force in the sort of the small, agile fighter planes going up to try to shoot at the big, slower flying German bombers. Any case, but it was pretty bad news for Britain there for a while. All right, so for quite a few months. Now, what happened is, in the earlier stages of the bombing, i.e., when sample sizes were smaller, people's overactive pattern detectors went to work, and people were like, So there's the River Thames, like Parliament. I guess I could have. I just reproduced a picture from this particular book where an author's talking about it, but I suppose I could have looked at my London map. Over towards the bottom right is going to be the Tower of London, London Bridge, and over towards the left, I believe, is going to be Parliament in the bottom left quadrant, I believe. In any case, all famous stuff is on the River Thames in London. So here's how the initial bombs were falling. Let's see, it's a sample size. Oh yeah, capital N, right, in all scientific studies, I mean, total sample size. Okay. Sample size 67 bombs, not so much. But people notice, now wait a minute, if you divide sort of this central part of London into quadrants, you'll notice that the bombs are not equally distributed across the quadrants. You know, if there's 67 major hits, then we should expect, you know, what, 17-ish? You know, 17-ish per quadrant, but that's not what we see. We see very few in the top right quadrant, quite a few in the bottom right, and something in between. In fact, we see the most in the top left and bottom right? So there's a diagonal there. So people got to be suspicious. And in fact, seems this was published in the diagram just like this. Maybe this very diagram, I'm not sure. I have to go back and check. I think something very much like this diagram was published in like the London papers. And so people immediately began to think, oh, wait a minute. Look how there's not bombs being dropped in the top right quadrant. I bet there's Nazi spies living there. I bet they're like, that's why they're not dropping bombs there. They want to drop bombs on their own. And so people went on sort of nighttime witch hunts looking for, I don't know, innocent people who maybe had an accent or I don't know what. Okay. So what this one guy, Tom Gilovich, does, whose name is listed here at the bottom, is he just notes that you can actually divide up this same area of central London in different ways and reach different conclusions, especially with our small samples. So here's a different way of dividing up central London. So instead of 4 quadrants, top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right, how about just 4 horizontal strips? And here's what we see, a very different picture. I went ahead and just made the numbers 0.5 if it looked like, you know, the bomb was exactly on the borderline here. So previously we saw that there was a diagonal pattern that really stuck out. Top left to bottom right. That's where most of the bombs were dropping. But that's only because we sort of divided up things into 4 equal parts in one particular way. But now when we divide up things into 4 equal parts in another way, we don't, it now looks like not that there's a, now we just see that just bottom is worse than top. You know, almost twice as many in the bottom half as in the top half. But Gilovich notes, well, you know, we can actually keep doing this. If you look to vertical strips instead, it looks like they're pretty evenly spaced, you know, 16, 17, 18, going all the way across. So notice whether there's a pattern at all depends upon the sort of grid lens through which we view the thing. Gilovich even notes that we could even do this. This is just more like, I guess, the 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. And again, we see a very different picture. I guess we still have southeast being sort of the bad place to be, as in the very first way of dividing up things. But it looks very differently. But by the way, I went to, after reading this and reading about this from this guy, Tom Gilovich, I went and I found this interactive website. hosted by the British government. So here's that exact same area of London. I don't know if you can tell that there's still the River Thames there in the bottom right. You see the blue? You don't see it initially, but if you look, you can see the blue curved line, right? Just like before. Okay, so now what pattern do you see? Well, not much. Now you will notice a little sparser over to the left, but that's exactly as it should be. I mean, Parliament, the banking part of London is to the east, and maybe even to the east just beyond the picture here. So if you want to hit Parliament and Big Ben and Westminster Cathedral and Tower of, I mean, the heart of London, the British Museum, the Tate Museum, you're not going to go way over there far to the left. But it's basically evenly distributed. In fact, and in the next slide, what I did is I just zoomed out on this interactive website. Same picture, zoomed out a little bit. That's actually the cluster of German bombs in London. Okay, they just bombed the hell out of it, right? But an important thing to notice here is, notice what I have still as the title for the slide, and this just concerns the law of, scare code's law of small numbers compared to the actual law of large numbers. If you really want to know what the Germans are doing, or trying to do during this period of time, it's the big sample that's going to tell you what's what. So here we have in the final slide where it's zoomed out, the big sample. What are they trying to do? Bomb the hell out of London. And essentially, yeah. And basically outside, you can see there's that blue line, the M25, and it goes around the outside of London. I mean, basically you're outside of London once you go beyond that. But inside that, they're just trying to bomb the hell out of it. So the very first slide concerning this that we showed, remember there were only, I think it was 67 hits. And that was initially published in the London papers. And people panicked about the pattern that they saw there. So something about that is just that there's two things about it. First of all, it still pertains to the law of small numbers. There may be a real pattern. The Germans may really be targeting one area, and they may really be staying away from some other area. That may be right. But if you have a small sample size, you need to be cautious and chill. Oh, assign a lower credence. Maybe you assign some credence to that, right? That there's a pattern. Okay, that's okay. That's actually okay. But it's the human tendency to assign the big credence. I'm really confident when you only see a small sample size. So a small sample size gives you some reason for credence. It's not as if sample size should just be dismissed as nothing. It just needs to be small, less don't put, massive amounts of faith in it. And then as more and more data get in, then sure, you can assign more and more confidence and more credence, because we know we're in a better position to have a better idea of what's actually going on. Okay. So this is the law of small numbers in work. So the law of small numbers, as defined by Daniel Kahneman, is the mistaken tendency to think that small samples reflect populations or broader reality more accurately than they really do. Here's a couple of ways I would just flesh out this idea based on the examples we've just been through. So the law of small numbers is the mistaken idea that if there's a pattern in the population as a whole or in reality as a whole, that pattern is going to show up in my small sample. That's a mistaken idea. If there really is a pattern in the population and you have a large sample, well then heck yeah, you should expect the pattern to show up in your sample. And of course, it's a representative sample and obtained in ways that are methodologically sound in other respects. But even if your small sample is methodologically sound, just by being small, you can't actually expect this. So just to be clear here, that what I have there is the second dotted point is a mistaken idea. It's the idea that if there's a pattern in the population, it will show up, even if my sample is really small. That's wrong-headed. But there's also the related point, the sort of dotted bulleted points 2 and 3 just sort of flesh out the first one. And so this most recent one, number 3, says, well, if there's no pattern in the population or reality, there must be no pattern that I will see in my small sample. And that's a mistake too. So the law of small numbers is a mistake, and these are just ways of cashing out what's in that mistake. So with the coin toss example and the London bombing example, we have a case where there's not really a pattern, really. Bombers are just trying to bomb everything in central London. I mean, yeah, they're looking at Parliament and stuff like that, but I mean, mostly there's not the quadrants thing going on that people thought based on the London Times. I think it was the London Times is the name of the paper, first published. Um, but I think it's easier to see this latter point when we go to the coin example. No pattern in the population. If I'm tossing a fair coin, I'm really going to see no bias in the direction of heads or against heads. I'm not going to see a bias in any direction. So no pattern of heads or tails being favorited. I should just see something equal. So you could either call that a pattern of a complete equal pattern of 50-50, equal heads, equal tails, or in some you could call that a no pattern. So if I'm tossing a fair coin, but tossing it only 10 times, people really expect more strongly that I'm going to see just 5 heads and 5 tails. And that's not really true. I could easily get, like I got in with my random number generator, 7 heads, 3 tails. Now if I toss a coin 1,000 times, and it really is fair and fairly tossed, and I get 70% heads, something's going wrong. I mean, it can't you should assign a super duper high credence that the coin's not really fair or not fairly being tossed. It is mathematically possible. I know the math. But I'm going to assign, and you should assign, super high credence that there's some funny business going on here. 1,000 tosses, 70% heads. And you're telling me it's fair and fairly tossed. No. But things are radically different, though, when we're dealing with, just 10 tosses. And but people don't sort of fully realize the respects in which the small sample can just give you all sorts of stuff that's unrepresentative of the population as a whole. So like with my random number generator, it was really was just randomly choosing between a 1 and a 0, which I used to simulate a heads and a tails. And if my sample is very large, then sure. If it's really random, then yeah, it is going to be totally equal, 50-50. More than just 1,000, but like bajillions. But random processes operating don't guarantee an evenly spaced distribution in small patterns, in small samples. So the final thing that I'll end on is just this. Years ago, I mean, I watched some of the first seasons of The Walking Dead, and man, that was some sucky script writing and some sucky acting. Whew, I'm not a fan of zombies and horrors and horror movies and stuff, but whew, glad to have bailed out pretty early on, ages ago, from watching crap shows. But here's just a scene from like season 2 of The Walking Dead. I don't even know if it's still on anymore. I don't care anymore. But something like season 2 of The Walking Dead, which you may or may not know since it's not as culturally relevant as it once was. Our little band of good guys down there. You see Daryl with his crossbow. And wait, is that his name, Daryl? I don't know. The redneck, whatever the redneck's name is. And they finally reached the CDC, Center for Disease Control in Atlanta. And it's a war zone. You see dead bodies everywhere. And what you're supposed to see is dead bodies left over from a battle scene. Not dead bodies carefully laid out. These are dead bodies from a battle scene. But do you see how evenly, neatly spaced they are? These are supposed to be just the way that the bodies happen to randomly fall. And the showrunners fell prey to the law of small numbers here. Their sample of bodies isn't huge, and they thought, well, if they're really just kind of randomly, haphazardly falling around, they're going to be evenly distributed. No, I mean, if in a super duper large sample of just tons of bodies randomly falling around, yeah, there is going to be a kind of evenness to spacing and distribution. But with these bodies, I don't know. Anyway, I'm watching this show, what, 8 years ago? I don't know how long ago this season was. It's been a while. Probably 8 years. I don't know. Something like that. If I'm pointing out statistical flaws in it, yeah, I'm that guy. People are getting annoyed with me. But this is the if hopefully you can appreciate that something about this distribution of supposedly haphazard distribution of dead bodies looks a little too neat and clean. Because it in fact is. There's going to be clusters. Some are going to be all clustered over. Well, first of all, aren't they going to be closer to the tank and clustered over there? Okay. In any case, to sum up, so all of evidence is based upon patterns. Knowledge of evidence is based upon knowledge, recognition of patterns, but our ability to recognize and detect when we've got a real pattern, the real deal, is fallible. Sometimes there's no pattern at all and we think there is. Sometimes there is a pattern, but we didn't look very carefully with very much of a large sample, and we think there's no sample. I mean, sorry, we think there's no pattern, but we're mistaken. Then you add in bias and ideology and expectations that cloud us into our minds into expecting to see things, and actually maybe even really seeing things because of how pervasively they saturate our minds. Then we get all sorts of our flaws in our reasoning about patterns, which means flaws in our reasoning about evidence. So this lecture did go on a little bit longer than I thought, but please try to. I do want you to watch it during the next week, and be prepared to talk about fallible pattern perception by the time your next test rolls around, which will be a little while, but go ahead and watch it now. Or I hope you have watched it now by now. Okay, thanks.